Almost every day this month, the daily reading comes from the Gospel of St. Luke. A few days from now, it comes from Luke's Gospel, the 20th chapter, verses 9 through 18. Hear the word of God. Then he began to speak to the people this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard and led it forth to husbandmen, and went into a far country for a long time. And at the season he sent a servant to the vine dressers that they should give him of the fruit of the vineyard. But the husbandmen beat him and sent him away empty. And again he sent another servant, and they beat him also and entreated him shamefully and sent him away empty. And again a third, and they wounded him also and cast him out. Then said the Lord of the vineyard, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. It may be they will reverence him when they see him." But when the husbandmen saw him, they reasoned among themselves, saying, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours." So they cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. What therefore shall the Lord of the vineyard do unto them? He shall come and destroy these husbandmen, and shall give the vineyard to others. And when they heard it, they said, "God forbid." And he beheld them and said, "What is this then that is written? The stone which the builders rejected, the same is become the head of the corner. Whosoever shall fall upon that stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder." In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This parable in the 20th chapter of Luke is often referred to as the parable of the wicked tenants, the ones who rented out the vineyard from the master of the vineyard, the owner. And because it's designated as the parable of the wicked tenants, it's usually assumed that the renters of the vineyard are the major players. And so the climax is positioned in the statement of judgment. He will come and wreak judgment on these wicked men and give the vineyard to others. But let's look more closely at it. The larger setting for this parable is what has taken place just a few days before this. Just a few days before Jesus made the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and then followed that with the cleansing of the temple. The cleansing of the temple was a very bold and dangerous act for Jesus and his disciples, and the temple authorities were outraged by it. After cleansing the temple, he had occupied the entire temple area for a few hours. We don't often think about that. And as St. Mark recorded, he refused to allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. The public had been using that whole area as a thoroughfare, a public thoroughfare. And Jesus and his supporters had blocked it and wouldn't allow any unauthorized bypass. They kicked over the tables of all of the merchants there. They drove out the animals, they drove out the merchants, and they drove out the buyers. Usually, as a boy, I would picture this happening in an area no larger than this and maybe even smaller. But the area we're talking about is 35 acres large. He and his disciples occupied the entire 35-acre temple area and blocked it off for the rest of the day. They shut down the afternoon sacrifice. It didn't take place. At the end of the day, he and his followers voluntarily withdrew. They'd made their public statement. The new Messianic king had claimed his own and had signaled the end and the destruction of the temple. And because of this, as it says in the scriptures, the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people sought to destroy him, but could not, because the people hung on his every word. The actions of Jesus were extremely provocative, and from that time on, he was only safe from arrest so long as he was protected by his popularity with the people. The crowds protected him, but the reaction of the authorities was inevitable. The first public response from the temple leaders came when the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to Jesus and confronted him and demanded to know by what authority he did these things. And in return, Jesus said, "You tell me something first. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or was it from man?" And they were trapped because of their fear of the people. They didn't answer him. They refused. And so he said, "Then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." And so they went away to scheme for another day. And in response, Jesus tells this parable of the vineyard and the tenants. A man planted a vineyard and he rented it out to others, and he went into a far country. And the time came to receive the rents, the profit from the vineyard, and so he sent a servant to collect them. And in the traditional manner of Middle Eastern stories, we have three scenes. The first scene, the first servant goes, and he's beaten. The second servant goes, and he's beaten and shamefully treated. And the third servant goes, and he's wounded and cast out. And the owner of the vineyard has to decide what to do, because he himself, in the person of his servants, has been shamefully treated. The owner of the vineyard has been thoroughly disrespected. His servants have been violently abused and shamed, and that shame falls upon the owner. How much violence and insult against his servants will the owner tolerate? And what response is expected? What will the owner do? Now, the people listening to Jesus were ahead of him. They already knew exactly what would happen. They knew what should be done and what the owner was expected to do. They had many examples of it. They know he will contact the authorities, who will send a heavily armed company to arrest the villains and bring them to justice and severe punishment. The abuse of his servants is an insult to his person, and he is expected, in fact, he is honor bound to deal with it. He can't let it go. His anger will be satisfied. The rabbis taught that when God's servant Moses was dishonored by Pharaoh, God himself went down to Egypt. That's how they taught it to the people. That's how they described it. God himself went down to Egypt and punished Pharaoh by inflicting the death of the firstborn on the Egyptians. So the people know how the owner is going to respond. It's not going to go well for the tenants. What's to be done with the anger generated by this great injustice, by this sin? He's in a position of power. Retaliation is possible, and it's expected by one and all. The tenants know this too, and they wait anxiously. This owner is in the same position as the man who threw a great banquet and sent his servants out to invite the guests, and one after another the guests insulted the man who was throwing the banquet and refused to come, giving very flimsy, ridiculous excuses and insulting him in the process. And yet the man turned his anger into grace. And instead of retaliating, he sent his servants out to invite all of the outcasts into the banquet. Here the master of the vineyard, hearing upon what happens to his servants, asks, "What can I do?" And we sense that there's a painful pause at this point while he processes his anger, his frustration, his pain, his anguish, his rejection, and his desire for justice. And then he decides, "I will send my beloved son." And at that point, you would have heard gasp from the crowd, shock from the crowd. What's he talking about? What did he say? He'll send his son? It makes no sense. When Esau went out to meet Jacob, he took 400 armed men with him. But this beloved son goes by himself, unarmed, to meet the vicious men who have already beaten and wounded the servants. Who would do such a thing? Who would behave so vulnerably? And why? Toward the end of last century, Hussein bin Talal was the king of Jordan. And one night in the early 1980s, the king was informed by his security police that there was a rather large group of Jordanian army officers, about 75 of them, in one of the barracks at that very moment, who were meeting together to plot a military overthrow of the kingdom. The security officers requested permission from the king to surround the barracks and arrest the plotters. And after a somber pause, the king refused, and he said, "Bring a small helicopter to the compound." He got into the helicopter and flew with the pilot himself to the barracks, landing on the flat roof, and then walked down 2 stairs to the room. Before getting out of the helicopter, he said to the pilot, "If you hear gunshots, then fly away at once without me." He knew that he was going in vulnerable, unarmed, and he knew that the men would want to kill him. He walked 2 flights down, walked quietly into the room, and then stood before them and said, "Gentlemen, it's come to my attention that you're meeting here tonight to finalize your plans to overthrow the government, to take over the country, and to install a military dictator. If you do this, the army will break apart, the country will be plunged into civil war, tens of thousands of innocent people will die. There's no need for it. Here I am. Kill me and be done with it." And after a moment of stunned silence, the rebels, as one man, got up and ran to the king and bowed before him, kissing his hands and feet and pledging their loyalty to him for all of their life. King Hussein had opted for vulnerability. He had acted nobly, and by so doing, he had fanned the flame of the dying embers of these men's sense of honor. In our parable, something similar happens, though with a different outcome. The owner decides, "I will send my beloved son," and then literally, perhaps they will feel shame in his presence. This implies that if they receive the son and respect him, they'll receive amnesty. Reconciliation will take place. Here we have a picture of God the Father sending his beloved son Jesus to his people. And he, like the son of the owner of the vineyard, was disrespected and killed. Just as Jesus was taken outside the city gates, so the tenants take the son outside of the vineyard and they kill him. To have killed him in the vineyard would have meant defiling the grapes, making them worthless. And then they exult and say, "The inheritance is ours." The son knew what they had done to the servants. The servants who symbolized the prophets who went before him to his people, some of whom were beaten, some of whom were tortured, some of whom were killed, most of whom were disrespected. The son knew what had been done to the servants, and yet he went as a willing sacrifice. And this is the climax of the story, because the tenants aren't the main players in this parable, but the master of the vineyard is the main player in this parable. And so the climax is his decision to be completely vulnerable to the people, his decision to give up unconditionally and freely his own life in his beloved son for the sake of the people. This is the climax of the story. And then when Jesus asks, "What shall the owner do to the men who killed the son?" he says, "We shall come and destroy the husbandmen." Most of us think of this story as a vengeance story, and so that should be the climax. He'll come and he'll take care of these wicked men. But it's not a vengeance story. The climax is the owner's decision not to take vengeance, not to pronounce judgment, but to send his beloved son and bring reconciliation. As St. Paul wrote to the Romans, God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. This is the nature of God. This is the nature of the Father. This is the Father's decision about us. It is to love us, to make peace for us and with us through his Son. As you and I spend time now in this nativity fast, fasting in preparation for the coming of our God as man, never forget that his coming to us is motivated out of love and not judgment, not vengeance. His coming is meant to bring peace and reconciliation for us with God. You need never fear that God loves you or doesn't love you. He does. You need have no doubt as to whether or not he will accept you. He already has in the person of Christ. He's already given all that he is to us and for us in the birth and life and death of his beloved Son. Glory be to God.